Hey everyone, super excited to have you all here for our Investor Ask Me Anything panel. I'm gonna run through a very quick introduction so that we can get right into the questions. But thank you to everyone for attending. Really excited for this one, and we have a great panel of investors answering questions today. So we know that fundraising is particularly tough right now, anywhere in the world, and it's a pretty opaque process. So the idea behind this event is to pull together some great investors from the Viaka network and kind of go under the hood with them to give founders in particular insight into like how they can best navigate that process. For anyone who doesn't know much about Viaka, but ended up discovering this event, first of all, welcome. Ahla wa sahla. Very glad to have you with us. Viaka is a digital community for founders, operators, and investors across the world with a connection to or interest in the MENA region. At this point, we have over 330 members across North America, Europe, and the Middle East and North Africa itself. Among other things, we have a members-only Slack workspace, virtual events like this one, small in-person meetups in cities where we have critical mass, demo days, and we're constantly speaking with our members to introduce new benefits and activities. Our next virtual event after this one is actually on June 12th, where we'll have a fintech demo day with 4 founders presenting to a panel of 4 investors from the network. We also have in-person events coming up in Boston, New York, the Bay Area over the next couple of months, and hopefully one in Dubai as well. So stay tuned for that. If you're not already a part of the network, highly encourage you to join. You can see the link to apply here on the screen. I'll also share that in the Zoom chat during this event. So I'm going to be moderating our panel today, but before I start, want to quickly introduce our investors. Huge thanks to them for joining us. I think one thing that's really neat here is we have a great geographic spread across the US, or North America, I should say, Europe and the Middle East. So just moving across the screen here, Sujude Dalieh is an investor at Jazz Venture Partners based in the Bay Area, where she invests in new opportunities and supports existing portfolio companies across all of Jazz's funds. Gaelle Yammine works at MEVP, which is a leading Middle East-focused venture capital firm investing in the early and growth stages of innovative technology. And I believe she's based between Dubai and Beirut. Ramzi Rafih is in London and Paris, and he's the general partner of No Label Ventures, which is a recently launched fund dedicated to investing in immigrant founders in Europe at the earliest stages of company creation. Omar Sati is the managing director at Dash Ventures, which he helped establish in 2011. Dash is a generalist firm investing between MENA and North America, and Omar, I believe, is based between Toronto and Amman. And finally, Mazen Hammad is an early stage healthcare investor with Optum Ventures based in Boston, which is also where I'm based. OV invests in digital solutions transforming how care is delivered, and Mazen is involved in all aspects of the investment process, from sourcing, diligence, execution to portfolio support. So with that in mind, I want to jump into the questions. I've crowdsourced these from founders in the Viaka network and prepared some of my own. If you're in the audience today and have questions as we go along, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will plan to carve out like 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the event to try to get to as many of those as possible. And yeah, we've had webinars like this before. I know 1 hour is not a lot of time. So there certainly will be questions that we won't get to, but we're going to try to get to as many as possible and get to the most important ones. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just dive in. as I mentioned to the panelists, I'm going to kind of direct each question to one person in particular, but everyone should feel free to jump in and add on to that. All right, everyone ready? Ready to get started? Awesome. First one, I want to start with just really simple tactical question. I think there's kind of two camps on this. When a founder is sending you a deck as an investor, do you prefer to receive that via link like a doc send, or to have a PDF attached to that email? And I think Gaelle, you had indicated that you can answer this one.
Yes, thanks, Hani. Hi, everyone. So usually, Hani, here the question is mostly related to every VC internal process. You know, we have a specific deal flow that goes into our internal system, and given that most of the deals are reviewed through our internal system, it is mostly a PDF that will be attached. Even if the deal is sent to a link, it will be converted at some point and reviewed at, you know, maybe days later. So while a link is good to update and keep the most relevant information throughout your fundraising process in one place, most of the time it ends up just being converted internally to a PDF, and this will be the reference in the internal database of an investor. So for the typical founders, definitely better to track engagement of the specific deal flow you're sharing. But for an investor, it will end up just being converted to a PDF, which, you know, would just be easier to send it as a PDF through email directly, just converting it through multiple steps.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on that from the rest of the group?
No, I agree with Gaelle, though. PDF's always better.
Sweet. When it comes to the deck itself, one thing that I've also heard different camps on is how much weight or investment at time should a founder put into preparing financial projections, especially if they're at pre-seed or seed stage. Is that even, you know, a slide that investors really want to see in such an early stage deck? Mazen, why don't you take a crack at this one to start?
Yeah, Henny, great question. You know, see quite a mix, and we invest kind of at the earliest stages. You know, seed stage, less so pre-seed. However, what I think is most important, at the end of the day, I think any forecast won't be taken at face value from an investor, and I think unpacking some of the assumptions will be very important. And so what I think is more important at the very earliest stages is really an understanding of how the business will generate revenue and make money. Who are their customers? Like, how would you kind of frame up growth, and how would you frame up like a market size, especially at the earliest stages? You know, making a compelling case that, you know, you're investing in a business that will disrupt $1 billion industry versus maybe a very small industry, a very niche industry, and like telling that big picture. The other thing that I would say is, as we think about forecasting, I think it's actually very helpful in a lot of, especially, you know, we invest seed to growth. So really after the series seed, we would kind of expect pretty robust view on the financials and what growth looks like for this year and for next year, et cetera. But I think what's maybe even most important at the seed stage for us, at least, you know, would love other thoughts as well, is a good sense of like unit economics and understanding, you know, if it's a SaaS platform, if it's a service, if it's a you know, many different offerings you can have out there, and like really understanding how it'll be profitable at the gross margin level, and then really sustainable kind of thereafter. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway I would say, is understanding the market sizing, understanding you know, unit economics in a way that gets investors excited.
Got it. Yeah. So if I was to kind of summarize, like, you know, have a clear articulation of business model, the market size, and how this actually makes money. Specific projections of like number of sales or clients or something like that is a little bit less important if you can nail those first three.
Yeah, and I would say most, that's exactly right. And I think it does change as a company matures, but really at those earliest innings, if it's going to go from 0 revenue to 10 million in revenue, like it's great to put that in a slide, but I think really understanding like what, like how and the why and the assumptions, and making sure investors can kind of understand that as well.
Awesome. Hammad, I guess next question is for you. As founders who are potentially like first-time founders raising their first round of external investment, go to do that, what are kind of the biggest or 3 most common mistakes that you see that lead you to pass on a deal that you think that founders should do their best to avoid?
I think the list is longer than 3, and I've been doing this for quite a long time, since 2010, right? So over the last 13, 14 years, and plus the mistakes that first-time founders used to make back in the early days, don't make these mistakes now. I think overall, at least if I'm looking at the MENA region, founders in general are a lot more mature, a lot more experienced, right? They're leveraging the knowledge and the information that's been shared, whether from webinars like this, online. There's so much information online on how to approach investors, how to negotiate, how to prepare a deck. I mean, everything is there, right? So there shouldn't be. I think there are no mistakes that will make us pass a deal. At the end of the day, you're not judging any founder based on a little mistake here and there. You're looking at a business. This is an investment opportunity, and you're looking at a business. Typically, for first-time founders, mistakes are usually made in building the rapport with investors, right? Some founders can be too pushy. Some founders don't take feedback very well, not really open-minded. I think this is where it's more of a character, personality thing that I think can sort of push investors away and say, based on this character, this is not somebody I could possibly work with for the next 10 to 15 years, because that's at least how we look at it, right? Is this somebody that I want to be deep in the trenches with for the next 10 years? Where grade doesn't really matter, where you have to be aligned and agree, and you have your characters, there has to be chemistry. So for us, I think the one major element, and I don't even think this is a mistake, right? This is just a character or a trait. They might go on to do fantastic on their own. They might not work with me, but they might work with some of the other investors on the group. But I mean, if I were to just summarize everything, I think one big mistake would be for first-time founders to reach out to investors, not having done some research on the investor they're reaching out to, or not having read a little bit about how to approach investors. When you have so much information at your fingertips, not to leverage that to work on yourself and understand the steps, that's just a big mistake in my opinion. But I think researching every investor, knowing who they are. We've had folks reach out to us telling us to invest in their company, which is a direct competitor to ours. The biggest one is they would in their email, they would talk about their competitors negatively, and one of those would be a portfolio company of ours. That's not a good way to start with to start a relationship with any investor.
I love that response, and actually touches on a couple other questions that came up. I mean, and I'll put these to the group. I guess one is on your very last point. One of the questions that came from founders in the network was, would any of you ever invest in a company that is competitive with a portfolio company of yours in a specific market, or is that a completely no-go area?
I think it's only reasonable if one of them is close to exit or public and one is pre-seed seed. But yeah, like if they're very far in different stages.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very subjective. Hani. Some folks do it, right? Because when you have a theme, when VCs have a theme or thesis for a certain vertical, you want to bet on multiple horses, right? Because at the end of the day, you believe in this trend and you want to back companies that do. For us at Dash, we have a policy from day one. When I established Dash, day one, 2011, we will not invest in competitive companies. We just don't do it. We want to back one horse, and that does get us into, I don't want to say hot water, but it creates more discussion than we'd like. So we immediately respond to a company and say, we can't invest in you because you compete with X. But then all of a sudden now we've opened the can of worms where they're trying to tell us how they don't compete with X. So then it becomes slightly more subjective, but we think you do, you say you don't. So I think you just need to dive deeper on, are you direct competitors or not? And if you feel like you are, then you don't want to do that. And I think larger organizations can actually do that if they manage to create this Chinese wall where you have to be sensitive to sharing information, and you don't want to jeopardize or compromise that. I think in this world, a lot of this information is proprietary, and if you can create those within an organization, which is very difficult to do, even law firms say they have that and others, and they can't even do it properly. If you can, then maybe you can get away with it. Otherwise, for us, we just
Got it. That all makes sense. And I wanted to also touch on kind of the other thing you mentioned, Omar, which was building a rapport with an investor. I think like sometimes it's a very hard balance to strike between being persistent, trying to, have a conversation or get a conversation with an investor versus just being annoying. So any advice that any of you all have on how to handle that in a way where you come across as like showing perseverance and persistence in these positive qualities that you would want to see in a founder, and not being annoying somebody that you couldn't see yourselves working with for 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I can jump in for a minute. I think what Omar said around building rapport is important, and like making sure there's a right fit. But even before that, I think to your question, Hani, it's like the work that goes into understanding, the types of investments that a firm makes, both from a stage standpoint, which is important, as well as the sectors, as well as what portfolio companies they might have that could compete, or just maybe even reinforce what could be a good investment for them because they're on a similar theme, a related theme that could be of interest. So I think it's if it's cold outreach, being very intentional who even not only the firm but like the person, and maybe who has been involved in those types of deals, or if there's someone who you can have other ties with, that just makes it a little bit warmer. That's helpful. And I think that's cold outreach, but if there's a world where you find that same person and using some hustle to find a way to have a warm introduction to them, having somebody connect you into them that might know them, might know you, obviously harder, but I think that's probably the easiest way to make sure you can kind of get in front of the right people.
Got it. Like speaking in the broadest terms, persistence, perseverance, it comes with like targeted kind of intelligent outreach. When it gets to be annoying is if it feels very generic and kind of just like shotgun approach. That's when I think, if I'm kind of summarizing the right way, that's when it can flip more towards just being annoying. So I did want to bring the conversation to kind of the unique fundraising environment that we're in today, particularly for Ramzi and Sujude, maybe for founders who are looking to raise right now. Do you kind of advise, for example, founders in your own portfolios to just raise enough to ride out the tough times that the market's seeing right now and then try to raise more in a year or so? Is it better to aim for a bigger raise so that you have longer runway to just like sit on as long as this market downturn lasts for? How are you telling your portfolio companies to think about fundraising right now?
I think it really depends. If you're a startup that is really struggling to raise, I mean, obviously it's whatever you can raise, and then just go on and build. If you do have the choice to raise more, and I think the question probably applies to that part, I would say be mindful of your own dilution as a founder. You don't want to be too diluted, but there are norms in this market. But I would encourage founders to err on the side of caution and raise more than they think they need. One, my experience, founders always underestimate their burn and how much they're going to burn. Two, I think as a just general matter of principle, just take money when it's there. You never know if if investors are excited about your startup, who knows, in a year's time they may not, because you haven't executed, or for whatever reason, maybe because your sector isn't as hot as it used to be, or whatever it is. So just as a general matter of principle, whenever you can take money, just take it. And then three, I think this environment may last longer than we think. I mean, may or may not. I mean, who knows? Maybe in 6 months, we're back into sort of 2021, era. But there's chances as well that this is the new norm, and it's gonna get probably more difficult to raise. So yeah, my sort of general advice is around the side of caution.
Yeah, I also think it depends on if your startup's going to hit cash flow positive with this raise. Like if you can get to a place where you don't have to raise again, then I would just raise as little as possible. So then you don't get that valuation hit. You don't give up a lot of your company. But I definitely think it's also going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, one thing that I've heard from founders specifically kind of like trying to raise right now is that having a conversation around valuation can be really tough, because founders might come in, with certain expectations about their own valuation based on previous market characteristics, and then they get in front of investors and find that investors are thinking on like a completely different, a completely different plane from them. So maybe Gaelle, for you, like how do you prefer that a founder think about valuation and present that to you when they're first like pitching you and engaging with MEVP?
Definitely there's, not a one size fits all kind of approach here. We've seen a good amount of company approach us with the usual, we're letting the market price and kind of approach. And then based on the initial appetite, they tailor the range they have in mind in a way that doesn't hurt the round, but get them maybe the higher end of the response they're getting, or push the investor they want to participate to increase their offer. But here, the best approach is never share a high amount that is just based on momentum, on hype, that you cannot back based on fundamental, on, a straight story that you're building within the traction and validation you're getting with the company. And it's not wrong, and as long as have their expectation and fundamental tailored to the circumstance and market condition we're seeing. So I don't like to go into a particular meeting, just trying to understand where this company is going and be hit by, oh, this is what we have in mind. We're closing in 3 weeks. You're either in or out. Like, I'm just trying to still cook with you as a founder. We'll have multiple meetings. We'll go to the diligence, go into the VDR first before discussing terms. But definitely, if there's already a term sheet on the table and they want to move quick because the round is wrapping up, a very valid, fair point. But if it's just at the beginning of the process and trying to accelerate the process by throwing numbers, I rather, just keep it to the important fundamental of the business first.
Makes a lot of sense. So kind of just to spit that back at you, is like better to come in most cases as a founder with an open mind, and maybe back to what Omar was saying at the beginning, like build that rapport, show the investor why your business is a great business before coming forward with like specific numbers to kind of, especially if you're using those numbers to generate like a false sense of urgency.
Definitely.
Listen, Hadi, at the very early stage, when you're talking about pre-seed and seed, even up to Series A, valuation is an art, not a science, right? We're not going to create these 10-year projections, the discounted cash flows and dividend deals. That's not how it works. And I think when investors like an opportunity, like the business, like the founder, and all the boxes are checked, having a discussion around valuation, assuming the valuation is reasonable, makes sense, right? You can look at comparables, you can look at growth, you can look at traction, momentum, you can look at some tangible and intangible things to try and come to a discussion around or a negotiation around valuation. And I think it's always great to negotiate. I think founders should always push back. I like seeing founders negotiate. Sometimes, we might throw in a few terms here and there, and we do it because we want to see how the founders react to something like that. But I think valuation is the last thing to discuss. Sometimes, founders will put that in a deck, like we're raising 2 million or raising 5 million at the $60 million valuation, and that doesn't help at all. And it's but if you do like the business, then you can obviously bring that back. I tend to like to look at valuation not as a quantum, but rather as dilution, especially at the early stage. So you go typically say, as an investor, what ownership would you like in this business, right? Depending on the many risks that you look at. Do you think this is a business that needs a 10% dilution or a 20 or a 25% dilution? And you look at that versus how much money they actually need to get them to the next phase. And then you work around that, the size of the round with the dilution, and then you'll come to various ranges of valuation. And then the rest is just coming to meetings of the mind.
Nice. Yeah, I love those answers. I think this is something that like founders really struggle with how to approach. So that's great. The next few questions are kind of focused on founders' most valuable resource, which I would say is time, and how to effectively use that. So, Ramzi, maybe one question for you is, what red flags should is everyone else hearing a bit of an echo? I think it went away now. Okay. Sorry. So for you, Ramzi, like, what red flags should actually founders look for in investors before taking a conversation? How can they know, that this is going to be a good use of their time as a founder?
Yeah, I think the first thing you want to do as a founder is just check what's sectors, stages, deals, those investors are investing in. And I think most VCs, if not all VCs, usually sort of have on the website sort of their portfolio, and including stages, sectors, location. So I think that like a quick look into their portfolios and just making sure your own startup fits that mandate, I think is typically pretty good. I would say the best reference checks on investors is through founders. Like if you know founders that raised VCs, ask them about or ask them to ask friends about those investors and just get references on them. And then once you're in front of an investor, VC investor, you can there's questions you can ask to validate whether whether they're actively investing or not, or whether they're they have sort of they're approaching the end of their fund and they have sort of no more capital to invest. So ask them about those things. Ask when was their last investment? How much of their fund is invested? How much do they reserve for follow on? There's questions you can ask those investors.
Another opportunity, I guess, that founders have quite often, particularly if they're good founders, if their business is seeing a lot of traction and momentum, is to present at something like a demo day, or participate in webinars, do things that kind of get them exposure as they're trying to fundraise. Any thoughts, Omar? You had I was thinking perhaps to have you answer this one. Like, do you see that as a valuable use of time? Do you see it more as a distraction? What's your take on like founders participating in those kind of things?
It really depends. It depends on the founder, depends where they are. I mean, I think it depends on the stage. I mean, I think there are founders that don't like really getting up at the, and in front of folks, demo day, don't like getting on to conferences. They'd rather be, heads down, building product, building their company, building some traction. But at some point, you're going to have to, it's all about raising money is all about exposure, and the more people know about you and know about your traction, and see the excitement, the more they're going to want to meet you, right? I mean, you can only be in stealth, as you know, to a certain extent of time. So I think demo day is good as long as it's the right demo day. Conferences can be fantastic if it's the right conference. So yeah, but I think doing too much of that is absolutely, I mean, a waste of time. I mean, there are startups that have been around for 7, 8 years, never fundraised, and it's because they keep winning these $50, $30, $20,000 checks at various startups competitions, and here we are 7 years later, and they're still chugging along. I mean, that to me is a waste of time, right? I mean, not to be harsh, but this is not how you build a startup. Do that in the early stages, especially if you can't get access to syndicates, angel funding, crowdfunding. But yeah, you have to manage your time. You have to be really smart about how you manage your time and how to get exposure. It's a delicate balance, and I think each startup, each founder at every stage will find a way to figure that out.
This is going a bit off script, but maybe I'd be interested, Omar, in your opinion on this, and Gaelle, since you're both investing in the Middle East, especially, like, do you feel like the opportunity to kind of go down that path where you're presenting at conferences and winning these competitions and stuff, that risk is more prevalent in the Middle East than in North America with like donor funded programs, etc., or it's really a trap that founders anywhere can fall into?
Gaelle, you want to get that first?
Yeah, sure. Look, I feel like there's always this appetite of, look, there's maybe an easy check I could get into this conference, good exposure, and you fall into this ecosystem loop where it's getting attractive to go into getting a drink, getting a coffee. There's a momentum. There's a few overlapping events happening, and you have to show presence. And building that exposure, you tend to get carried away by being exposed to all of these while just disregarding building a business. We're seeing it in the MENA, given maybe that in the MENA there is quite a lot of funding available through accelerator program events as well, but I'm sure maybe it's also prevalent in the rest of the world. It's also a question of maybe availability of capitals when you're early stage, and as Omar mentioned, if there's you don't have the network, you don't have the angels, you gotta go into that loop, and then first check is attractive enough to go in and try to get another third, fourth check, and then you realize, okay, 2-3 years went by and you didn't really get where you should have been.
Yeah, so I agree. I think the reason that I would mention is I think it's everywhere, and the only reason why we hear it more in the MENA is I think, first of all, you're looking at a much smaller pool in the MENA region of startups, but I think the reason is just the option, right? You can only number of these angel networks, etc., within your own country or regionally, whereas in the US, you have startups can go and get 100, 200 no's, before they revert back. Plus, there's so much different types of capital, right? Like you said, donor money, grants, X, Y, and Z. In the region, you don't really have much of that. And what you are seeing a lot more of today is everybody wants to put together a demo day or some sort of an event for entrepreneurship. And this is a way for you to get these small checks. So I think it's limited optionality sort of forces you to go down that route. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. On one end, you can look at it as these guys are hustling and they're trying to find a way to keep their company, right? It's like survive, then thrive, right? So they're trying to find a way to survive, and then at the end, hopefully thrive and find the right investor, find the right capital. It's just, and I was having this conversation, by the way, yesterday, just because of an article that was posted on LinkedIn. I'm not going to get into that because this could be a 1-hour thing, but it's like, when do you throw in the towel? When do you say, I've done everything that I can, it's not working, I've tried everything that I can, it's time to throw in the towel? When is the right time to do that? Sometimes, you're so close and you don't want to give up. Other times it's pride. You're too obsessed with this idea that you're not willing to change it. So that's a great question, and something that that we can on this panel can probably debate for days.
One other question on just use of time. This one is, I think, especially for you, Sujude, is like, do you think it's worth a founder's time to try and dig in with an investor that's already passed the reasons why they passed, or is it better just move on, like find your backers and dig deep with them?
I think it's always worth a try. I think founders should always do that follow-up email asking for the reasons or just bullet points on what they could have done better. And I just wouldn't expect the VC to respond half the time, but when they do, that's really helpful insights. I think getting into the mind of why people are passing is the number one, like, golden nugget of fundraising.
And yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on it, but the flip side of that, getting into the mind of the investor, Gaelle, you had mentioned that you could answer this, but open to everyone is like, you kind of said it, like half the time you're probably not going to get a response. Why is that? Is it just a time thing, bandwidth? Or are there other reasons that investors might not respond to those kind of requests?
For me, it's usually
think
bandwidth, but yeah, someone else can respond.
Yeah, bandwidth. Also, I think like sometimes it comes down to the founders themselves, and and you don't want to say that as a it is a difficult thing to do, especially that I think as investors we're wrong more often than not, and so you don't want to be in a situation where you're discouraging the founder because you have an assumption on them or on their business, and then you end up being wrong, and ultimately you didn't do anyone a favor. So I think there's a little bit of that. Personally, I try to give feedback whenever I think it's constructive. Whenever I think it may not be constructive, I just don't give it. And I know a lot of investors say, yeah, I always give feedback, and it's very good to give feedback, but sometimes it's not, because sometimes your own feedback is wrong, and that founder is gonna end up doing great things. So I think it's a delicate thing to consider.
Also, to add here, I think that a great company isn't always a good investment, and feedback, is feedback given here in this instance, it could get blurry given that founders are persistent by nature, and as you should mention, taking no as an answer is not always the go-to approach. So here you'll always get founders trying to ping you a few months later, and you'll have to try to justify every time that it's not you, it's me. I'm looking for something else. I have certain criteria in mind I'm trying to meet. And at the end of the day, specific feedback could be helpful, as Ramzi mentioned, but we're never always right. So what we think could be working in this specific vertical, in this specific country, might not be, the winning mix or the secret sauce for a particular approach. And it's just with time and with enough, traction, validation, we're able to see if we're right or not.
I wanted to continue kind of in this vein of looking into the mind of investors, and actually a question for you as well, guys, since you talked about like how founders can sometimes try to use things like valuation to generate a false sense of FOMO. What are things that really cause you to have FOMO as investors? See a deal and you're like, wow, I really want to be a part of that. What are aspects that founders can highlight that are like more authentic and really kind of generate that desire on your end?
Founders would generally have spent some time in a particular vertical or space and try to build their story, build their fundamentals. Why this space, why this market right now is the good time, and why this particular approach is the winning approach, with a certain amount of variables through validation, execution, strategy to back their story. Someone who's well prepared, really know their space, but also is not afraid to say, these are the unknowns we're trying to figure out. The red flag here is a salesy founder, someone who's trying just to close the round quickly, build the momentum just for the sake of building a momentum, or trying to see that, okay, this vertical is gaining some traction, let's replicate something similar in untapped market. We've seen maybe this wave with the expense management player in the Middle East. It started with the boom and ramp globally and Brex, etc. And we saw 15 players popping up in the midst of 6 months. You ask here, maybe what's the story, what's the really fundamental of the business? You hear a lot of similar answers in a unpenetrated space. that also is trying to generate FOMO given the potential and success cases in replicable market and geographies. So here, sticking to fundamentals when talking to an investor is, I guess, sorry, to a founder, is what would generate FOMO for me to be part of this journey, betting on the team itself and what they wish to execute within their vision.
Awesome. Want to also kind of touch on a process that I think is part of the opacity of investing for founders, which is the diligence process. Mazen, maybe I can ask you first, kind of like, why does it take so long, or at least it feels like so long for founders, for investors to go through diligence? What, for example, does the diligence process look like at OV? Just, you know, pull back the hood a little bit on that one.
Yeah, it's a great question, and pretty opaque, and I know it'll be quite different across the board. So we'll kind of share specific to OV, but hopefully is applicable broadly. You know, I think a few important things, just defining like long. I used to work in more like buy-side M&A, which would operate in like many months. So call it 3, 6, 9 months at a time. And I think in the venture world, you know, things probably take a month or 3 to 4 weeks, 3 to 6 weeks, start to finish. And honestly, that's quite an accelerated time if you think about, to Omar's point, you know, having to think about partnering with this founding team and this business who could, you know, be competitive to something in the future that you haven't seen yet, and, you know, have to be kind of in the trenches with them over the next 10 years. Like, it's a big commitment, and underlying that, just like how things are done, I think, you know, for us, what it looks like, really, it's getting an opportunity to hear the vision, hear the pitch, and then just for us, we like to go deep from a diligence standpoint and think about that as unpacking, especially if it's more of like a Series A or later type business, the financial model, the customer the customer pipeline, the forecast. So that's one piece of it. You know, we spend a lot of time in healthcare, so there's like a clinical due diligence, like understanding the efficacy, like, and a lot of this, again, you can facilitate through a data room and through calls, but think about each of these as like, you know, its own topic that I think you're looking to try to check all the boxes. Technology due diligence, especially if it's a tech-oriented, you know, SaaS product or platform, you know, that's also really important. And then generally, I think for most groups, getting an opportunity for the founding team to meet the broader partnership, you know, and pitch them more broadly. And then sometimes that happens, sometimes it's more isolated to the 1 or 2 people that are basically like managing or running with the deal. And then after that, really, I think this is probably typical most places, but, you know, that investment team has to, you know, basically present out to the committee their things and like have a dialogue. And so even as something as simple as scheduling, I think, you know, you can lose a week, you can lose a couple of weeks. So I would say, you know, it's really important, I think, to manage. I think part of the piece around FOMO here, like trying to like manage a process as a founder is important. So trying to set up guidelines around, okay, we're getting everyone the data room at a certain point, and then, you know, try to manage to like have all those calls and meetings over a few week time period. And then like at a point where you feel like there's enough diligence has been done, like following up if you haven't heard back, and trying to like take the reins a little bit. Because I think if you don't, what could happen is, you know, everyone's balancing many things, new investment opportunities, helping with existing portfolio companies, raising new funds. Like there's so many in life. I mean, life is another half of this coin, right? So trying to be top of mind at the right time and like manage and own your process is also really important. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, super helpful. And I'd be interested, like maybe for you, for example, Ramzi, you know, working on a much smaller team, how do you handle diligence? You know, given that you're doing a lot of it on your own.
Yeah, so it's a one-man team in my case, and
Yeah.
I think the key thing is to so I invest at pre-seed mainly and seed to some extent, and you know, when you're investing at pre-seed, you're investing really in founders, and you're not really investing in you know, sort of numbers or sometimes you're not even, there's no product even. So I think a lot of the diligence that I do is try to understand how good a founder is, and yeah, I'll do research on their market. You know, I'll bring on board some experts either in my network or, you know, and that I'll just reach out for. So I'll try to do all of that good thing, but then the ultimate goal is always, you know, is this a good founder or not? And the way to challenge them is by obviously asking smart questions about the sector. So there's a lot of work being done to understand the sector, to understand how their product compares. But ultimately, the goal is to understand how good they are. And I try to do references on founders as well as much as I can. So, you know, being very sort of early stage also means that you know, there's a limited amount of diligence you can do because you're ultimately just solving for the only question, which is, you know, is this a good founder or not?
Nice. We're at about 10 minutes left, so I'll try to pull some from the chat. Anyone can feel free to jump in as I read these out. One of the first ones that we got was just, as investors, how do you feel when looking at solo founders, especially in the early stages of looking at a company? Does that, like, do you have a strong preference for co-founders? Are you okay with solo founders? Do you prefer it? How do you feel about looking at solo founders?
I mean, as a solo investor, I love solo founders, so nothing against it. I think, I mean, obviously it depends, like on your own skill set, on your own understanding of your own skill sets as well, and whether you're aware of them, and whether you're aware of your own limitations and where you need to hire people later on. But in itself, I think if you are, as a founder, comfortable being on your own and you have that mental, you know, resilience to go through things on your own, then, you know, I get excited about solo founders.
There's another question here, which I think ties into one that we had prepared before around like AI. Of course, everyone's excited about AI, but you know, Sujude, you had mentioned in our document around why it's important to just incorporate the latest technology into your business and why you should be on top of those trends. So would love to have you kind of elaborate on that point and why you think that's important when looking at companies.
Yeah, I think, well, one, like these large foundational models are quite revolutionary. And if you're not up to date on them, it's kind of signaling to an investor that you're not, you're not keeping your company as efficient and as productive as possible. Even if a daily worker is using just ChatGPT to optimize everything they're up to, your company should also be using these off-the-shelf solutions to also optimize your company. But yeah, I don't think your company has to be AI at all to raise. It doesn't, it helps. Don't actually raise absurd right? Companies using GPT-3, GPT-4, etc. But yeah, I think everything that you guys are doing, whether it's healthcare, biotech, or just consumer products, has to be the latest, and you should know what the market's up to.
Awesome. See, there's also a question or two, kind of looking at the MENA region specifically. So this would be, you know, for Omar and Gaelle. What would you say are like the top 3 sectors that you're most excited about in the region today? Some of the examples thrown out were fintech, edtech, Web3. What are the 3 sectors that you're looking the most at?
So if you look at the MENA historically, you could see that as a derivative of, you know, the boom in e-commerce, like in any other sector or ecosystem, we had a sector boom like mobility, logitech, fintech, obviously. So the concentration of the fund goes around those vertical and sectors specifically. Today, things are changing. Obviously, we're seeing other nascent industry catching up, like health tech, ed tech, and we're seeing some of the trend we saw in logitech, mobility, fintech being replicated across the board. We're definitely excited about, you know, the potential of implementing artificial intelligence within subsector and industries. here, how, you're not just building standalone AI product, but existing startup are using them to their benefit to make the most out of the current resources, funding, capital, etc. that is accessible on the table. In terms of in the region, given maybe some nascent sector or untapped geography, particularly excited about infrastructure play. The ability to tap into some core layers, and from that building a stickier, applicable product with higher retention, and building on top of it some really good add-on or layer that can support the ecosystem across the board and benefiting from general growth and trends we're seeing on a macro level.
I'll just try to add a little bit to that, which is, I think, in terms of models as well, not just sectors, but we saw a lot of, over the years, it was very much B2C focused. And I think we're beginning to see a lot of B2B, which is part of the evolution of the ecosystem. It was very difficult to build SaaS back in the day, but right now, just given digitization and awareness and adoption of new technologies, we're actually seeing a lot of business or enterprise software solutions, which is fantastic. Harder to sell, but still in multiple categories. I think, from my perspective, I think fintech still excites me, but I'm biased. I'm a finance management background all the way going back to college. I worked in banks, investment banks, did so many. So I sort of understand the finance world very well, and I love seeing, and I know the issues of the finance world because I've done so many different subsectors. So I can very quickly grasp and see what these fintechs are trying to disrupt or what they're trying to fix. The reason why fintechs are around today is because, finance is essentially broken, right? From many different layers or pockets all the way up to banking, whatever it is. But I also think healthcare and health tech or digital health is a huge disruptor. I mean, if you just look around you, healthcare, insurance, all of these are not just broken, but I mean, they're still living in the 60s and 70s, right? So lots of change is coming, I think, to those sectors, and I'm very excited about that. EdTech, well, I think EdTech does need to change. I think there was a lot of hype around EdTech during the pandemic because everyone was back home. But I think schools today now are a little bit more open to adopting technology as well. That's exciting. But I'm also saying we're seeing too much of the same, right? I don't, when I see too many variants of the same thing, but it's slight change, to me, it makes an industry or a sector very unattractive. So I try to move out. I tend to like to look at things when others are not looking at them. That's what gets us excited.
Awesome. Probably time for one last. Sujude, did you want to add something? Yeah. One last question from the chat that I liked, which is like, let's say you're a founder, you've pitched to an investor and they passed. When is a good time to potentially re-engage them? What should you show them when you're trying to get back in touch? What are the indications you should look for that you should even try to get back in touch with them? And I would say this one's open to the group.
It's a great question. I would say it always depends, but if you were left with, quite commonly, many reasons or a big reason why an investment might not be the right fit, at least in Series C, Series A, or Series B, is really a question around traction and okay, it's hard to lean in now. We're excited, but we would love to, see whatever it is, whether it's the product build or start to see commercial traction come to fruition. And then we would love to invest. If you have an update and you were able to turn the corner and you want to re-engage with the investor, I think that's a good way. And then also, as you raise a new fund or a new round rather, and you're going back out and maybe it's a investor that you spoke with 8 months ago, I think it's worth definitely re-engaging in a new process as well.
My quick 2 cents here would be, if an investor does not tell you, we would like to revisit this in the near future, then they most likely don't want to revisit, at least from our perspective. When we like a business, but it's too early or they haven't hit specific milestones or gotten the traction that we wanted, we will tell them we'd like to revisit this, and then they would typically come back, or we'd say, add us to your investor newsletter or whatever updates, or send us updates. But if we don't say we'd like to revisit this in the future, we typically are just not interested in the business or the founders or the model. And even if they do try to come back, we won't. So I think being smart about trying to extract that information from the investor, or just blatantly asking them, would you like to revisit this later on if we hit specific milestones? Some investors will actually tell you what they expect. Not many. It's also difficult. There are times where we don't know, but some investors will tell you, when you hit this level of revenue, this level of active users, X, Y, and Z, let's chat again. And then that's where you'll know when to come back.
Makes sense. Makes sense. As you saw, we had some folks already have to drop. We're at the hour right now. Could certainly go on with like hundreds of more questions, I think, but really appreciate your time, Omar, Gaelle, Mazen, and thank you to Sujude and Ramzi as well for sharing their time and insights. And thank you to everyone who joined and who submitted questions ahead of time. Really appreciate you all, and looking forward to having you in the Viaka community and having more events like this. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hani.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Hani. Thank you all. Nice meeting you all. Take care.